The hall in which they found themselves was simply decorated and furnished. A frieze of blue flowers ran along the walls. A clock hung on the wall facing the devotees. Below it on a shelf there were a few tin containers. Presently she saw the Maharshi take some nuts out of one of the containers for the squirrel that had run to him along the back of the couch. Next to the couch was a revolving bookcase, and further down the hall stood two plain wooden cupboards holding more books and a small store of stationery. Little attempt had been made to create a mystical or spiritual background for the Maharshi. The furniture was functional, the surroundings ordinary. Yet the banal setting could not detract from the grandeur of the sage. He was exceptionally unbelievable, first of all, in just being himself. In every action he made, whether he was correcting a manuscript or reading a letter, there was a complete naturalness and absence of pose. This is very rarely seen, for few are those who, being rooted in their true identity, have no need to seek a flattering image of themselves or confirmation of what they are from impression they make on others. Once, during the morning, the Maharshi turned and looked directly at Suzanne. She would write to us about his wonderful gaze, his brilliant eyes shining like stars. At 11 o'clock, the Maharshi and the devotees rose and left the hall, for it was time for the main meal of the day. Someone from the ashram invited Suzanne and the two ladies with her to join the others. The meal was served in the communal dining hall, where rows of freshly washed plantain leaves had been laid out on the spotlessly clean stone floor. The Maharshi took his place among the devotees. The Brahmins sat on one side of him and the non-Brahmins on the other, thus respecting religious customs. The Maharshi, though, did not wear the Brahmin thread, and she remembered that on arriving in Tiruvannamalai, he had thrown away the thread worn by the hereditary caste that indicated superiority over others. They were served rice, vegetables, pepper water, and milk curds. Maharshi ate very frugally. He asked Suzanne whether the food was not too pungent for them. These words of solicitude were the first words he spoke to her. In the hall, she then joined the devotees who had come to spend the afternoon with the Maharshi. She did not see some of those who had been present in the morning, but several newcomers were there. She was surprised to hear that devotees might come into the hall as early as 4 in the morning, though 7 o'clock was the time most morning visitors gathered. They spent a few hours with him, but he was accessible to them all day. As in the morning, the mood was rather informal. To these pupils aspiring to attain the highest grades of knowledge, the Maharshi apparently did not give any discourses. He replied to questions when they were put to him, usually very succinctly, as if to let the one word or a few words he said make their way directly into the understanding of the questioner. On the other hand, when a young man struggled to grasp what the self was, the Maharshi, with great patience, guided him through his reasoning until at last he got some glimmering of what the Maharshi meant. Of course, the answer to the nature of the self is only to be found on the intuitive level, but the breakthrough of intuition can be hampered by faulty reasoning. Apart from these exceptions to silence, there were long, quiet moments when the Maharshi said and did nothing, but which were more effective in conveying transcendent truth than any lecture or sermon would have been. The afternoon ended with a 20-minute break. The Maharshi and the devotees gathered in the hall again at 5 o'clock for the evening session. Suzanne found that the atmosphere now was quite different, much more solemn and charged with more energy than early in the day. First, there was the recitation of the Vedas by a group of young Brahmin boys and their preceptor. As the powerful Sanskrit syllables vibrated in the hall, Maharshi's appearance underwent a remarkable change. His expression became austere. His gaze turned inwards. His face appeared translucent, as if lit by inner illumination, whilst the constant slight trembling of his body, which Suzanne had noticed earlier, had now completely stopped. Yet even in this state, it was evident that he was not oblivious of his surroundings, and that he had an awareness of both the inner and outer reality. Suzanne was to write about her impression of the Maharshi with these words: "He is an adept of the highest order, a king of yogis. The splendor of his realization radiates like a sun. Robed in either his yogic powers, though they are subtle and unique and rare, he lifts you far above the world." After the Vedas, the devotees sang together a hymn to Arunachala. They then sat in deep silence, capturing the force emanating from their master, a force so strong as to be almost tangible. To her surprise, she now saw all the women rise, and after prostrating to the Maharshi, file out of the hall. She did not go with them. One of the men came and explained to her that the ashram management had made the rule that women must leave the ashram before 6:30 p.m. so that they could safely return before dark. She protested that she was not afraid of the dark and asked to be allowed to stay as long as the men. The Sarvadakari, alerted that there was some trouble in the hall, arrived and told her himself that the ashram rules must be respected. The Maharshi did not intervene at any time during this incident. Very upset, Suzanne left the hall, and she found her two friends from Adyar waiting for her outside. They looked dejected because they had just found out that there was no guest house for women at the ashram, and they would have to find some accommodation in town. They tried to persuade her to go with them, but since she refused, they left without her. Suzanne declared to the small group of ashramites who were trying to pacify her that since she could not stay in the ashram, she would go and spend the night on the hill. She climbed some way up the hill and without difficulty found a cave in which to shelter. She entered its dark interior. In spite of her bravado, there was a little fear of finding herself confronted by some wild animal. But she was alone. She had meant to spend the night in meditation, but it was impossible for her to meditate, so great was her feeling of indignation at what had happened. Meeting a true master had been the event she had longed for, and she had so much hoped to receive some indication from him that he had accepted her as his disciple. Instead, at what had been the most significant moment of the day for her, she had been made to leave his presence because she was a woman, which in this society obviously meant someone weak and inferior. The incident aroused in her an old impulse to revolt against exclusion because of arbitrarily determined inferiority, a reaction which went back to her student days when more than once she had been indignant at the unfair discrimination against women. In fact, the feeling went still further back to her early childhood when she had first understood that her parents valued her less than her brother, and that whatever she might do, she would never be able to take his place in their pride and affection. It was strange that on her very first day with the Maharshi, her oldest pain and anger should have risen to the surface. Her anger drove all other thoughts from her mind. It was then that she had a vision of Arunachala as a hill of fire. In its many caves, siddhas, or realized beings in their pure and invulnerable bodies, sat or moved unharmed in the flames. In her vision, she was taken into the hill, and she too entered its fire, but felt no fear, no pain. And she saw many worlds existing within the hill in a series of extraordinary revelations. Sometime afterward, she confided that she had seen another devotee, Mrs. Lucia Osborne. At the time, Mrs. Osborne did not think it was important, but a few years later, when another person reported a similar experience, she asked the Maharshi about it. As she would write in her editorial in the ashram journal, The Mountain Path, Sujata was taken into the hill and found a whole universe there. When I asked the Maharshi if it would be so, he replied, "Yes, The hill is the heart. While Suzanne was on the hill that night, the Maharshi, knowing that there were wild animals such as cheetahs and leopards and jackals on its slope, asked Mr. Cohen, a former theosophist who had known her at Adyar, to go and persuade her to come down. When Mr. Cohen and his party found her, she was calm, being still under the influence of her wondrous vision. Without further protest, she agreed to spend the rest of the night in a hotel in town. The next day, she came to the ashram somewhat embarrassed by her impulsive action and wondering whether she would be reprimanded for it. But the Maharshi did not say anything. When somebody asked to take a photograph of the Maharshi with the foreign devotees at the ashram, he agreed, although he did not always agree to be photographed. Seeing that Suzanne hung back a little diffidently, he made a sign to her that she was to join them. In this photograph, the devotees are grouped before Arunachala as if forming a hill with the Maharshi at the center. This is the last photograph in which Suzanne appears clad in the Buddhist robe, for she stopped wearing it shortly afterwards. In Bangalore and in the Buddhist monasteries in the north, where she had been accepted unquestioningly as a Buddhist nun, she had not felt self-conscious when wearing the robe. But here, in this predominantly Hindu milieu, her Buddhist robe was not understood, and as a result, she felt self-conscious and on the defensive. The Maharshi did not ask her to stop wearing it. That was not his way. There were never any dictates from him. His teachings did not lay down rules of conduct. They provided guidance as to how to achieve selflessness, which was the basis of realization.